Well, I'm glad to be back with you all, and I'm happy to be able to tell you something about the Universalist Unitarian Church that you may not have known. When I went to get my hair cut on Thursday, my hairdresser said to me, "I saw your name on the billboard of that gay church." So I found it a more than usually illuminating hair-cutting session. So maybe it's foolish of me to stand here at the gay church to tell you about gay marriage, but that's what I'm going to do. Gay marriage. I'm opposed to it. Now, not for the reasons that most people usually cite. For me, it's not about religion. It's not about any moral criticisms of homosexuality. And it's not because I think there's any reason to define marriage as solely heterosexual. And it's certainly not because I think that the right to civil union is open to debate. In fact, if you just go from a civil rights standpoint, gay marriage is a no-brainer. Of course, gays and lesbian couples should have the same right that straight couples enjoy, the right to join their lives legally and to participate in whatever legal and social benefits come with such joining. Thus, from that standpoint, the civil rights standpoint, I will, of course, fight hard for the right to gay unions. I don't really see how anyone interested in civil justice could argue against it. So what's my problem? Why am I, a lesbian, standing up here telling you, a group of thoughtful people interested in justice, that I have qualms about gay marriage? Well, I bet that you won't be surprised to learn that I plan to explain myself. But before I can do that, before I can show you how I differ from many of my straight and gay counterparts, I want to at least look at the issue as it's being currently debated in the media and in courts and religious groups across the country. Because I think it's important that we know just what it is exactly that many of the people opposed to the civil right of gay union are actually opposed to. And when you examine the rhetoric, you quickly realize that there's a great deal more at stake here than simply the idea of extending the right of legal union to same-sex couples. The gay marriage debate is about a lot more than marriage. In many ways, it's about the very construction of our society. That's why so many people find it frightening, and I do too, although for very different reasons than the conservative right. Now, on the surface at least, the debate does seem to focus on concepts of marriage. Those opposed to gay marriage argue that marriage, by definition, is between one man and one woman. Many people take their definition from religious sources. God says marriage is male and female. Jesus says marriage is male and female, they say. But not everyone takes the religious stance. Some people argue about the purpose of marriage in general. It is to raise children, they say, or to provide a stable family environment. Now, from the standpoint of just logic, it's pretty easy to challenge these arguments. The Christian position, for one. People argue that the definition of marriage as one man and one woman is universal and unchanging, that it's a bedrock of Christianity. But you don't even have to be a professional historian to see that such claims aren't true. Marriage has been defined in all sorts of different ways over the course of the Judeo-Christian history. It's even defined variously in the Bible itself. I'm not the only person to point out that many Old Testament references support polygamy, and many modern-day polygamists even argue that the New Testament supports, or at least it doesn't prohibit, polygamy. And from polygamy, we can move to same-sex unions. John Boswell, a respected historian from Yale who has written a great deal about gays in the history of the early Christian church, has recently shown that even the early church had what appear to have been rites of same-sex unions. Church liturgical documents from the 10th and 11th centuries described ceremonies called the order of uniting two men and the order of uniting the sex. Now, whether such unions were what we would today call heterosexual or homosexual relationships is unclear. We don't know exactly what those relationships were. But what is clear is that the Judeo-Christian church has not had one single, universal, unchanging definition of marriage as being between one man and one woman. And even if it did, such a definition would be completely irrelevant to our legal definition of marriage in 21st century America. I know I'm not telling you anything you don't already know when I point out that the separation of church and state means that we don't make laws, let alone constitutional amendments, for the purpose of supporting or establishing as official the tenets of any particular religion. Thus, all these arguments about the sanctity of marriage and about God's definition of marriage are simply red herrings. They don't matter, at least not in terms of federal or state or local laws. Now, religious practices are something else again. I would say that it's up to each denomination and each religious sect to decide how it will define marriage. I would be perfectly happy if we used completely different terms. Let the word marriage be kept solely for religious purposes. If church and state are really separate, then the state should get out of the marriage business altogether. Let the state provide only civil unions. Take the word marriage out of our civil ceremonies. Don't let the courts give marriage licenses. No more allowing priests and rabbis and ministers to function as deputies of the state. No more allowing religious ceremonies to double as legal ones. I would be much happier if we practiced the same procedure that the Germans do, for instance. In Germany, anyone who wants to marry has to do it with a civil ceremony. Then later, if the couple wants to, they can have a religious ceremony. But they don't have to. Legally, the first ceremony is required. The second one isn't. If people are concerned about the religious implications of such a system, we can point out that Germany has long been a primarily Christian country. They obviously don't see that system of separating legal and religious marriages as being incompatible with religious belief. Now, I don't really think that we have a chance of establishing such a procedure in the United States, but I think it would be good if we could, because we could finally put to rest the confusion about legal unions and sanctified marriages. I think the state should offer legal unions to mixed and same-sex couples alike. The church can take over marriage. If religious groups choose to prohibit same-sex marriage, that's their prerogative. But it is not the prerogative of the United States Constitution to define marriage as anyone's God might define it. The Constitution is not about restricting rights. It's about guaranteeing them. And this is just an aside, but I just can't see that the Supreme Court would ultimately uphold the constitutionality of a marriage amendment, even if it got passed. And I think maybe even George Bush realizes this. But I'm not ruling anything out, because at lunch at Emory and Henry a few weeks ago, we were talking about gay marriage, and one of the professors said, "Well, there's not going to be a constitutional amendment. It's just such a bad idea." And somebody said, "So is prohibition." As indeed it was, but that didn't stop it from becoming a constitutional amendment. So it's very possible that, we will throw over logic and go with a gay marriage amendment. But I do think that in the long run, constitutional reason will prevail, and there would be a sort of repeal. I kind of like the idea, though, of prohibited gay marriages. You could have gay marriage speakeasies, you could open the little door. Anyway. So where are we in our assessment of the logic of the current anti-gay marriage arguments? And I know I just said that I wanted to separate unions and marriages, and then I'm going ahead and mixing up my terms again, but it's just a convenient shorthand, and you know that when I say marriage or union, I'm referring to the legal joining of a couple. I think so far we've seen the irrelevance of religious opposition. But what about those people whose opposition is not based on religion, but on a concept of marriage that sees the purpose of the institution as providing a healthy place to bear and rear children? This is an assertion I've heard a lot, from statements made by politicians to people writing letters to the editors of Time and Newsweek. Marriage is about children. Marriage is about families. Marriage is about mixed-sex parents. Marriage is not for homosexuals. Well, even before donor insemination and other reproductive technologies, homosexuals have always been able to produce children, and many of them have, within heterosexual unions and out of them through adoption and other means. So the argument that gays shouldn't be married because they can't produce children is obviously not valid. But what about people who argue not that gay people can't be parents, but that they shouldn't be parents, that they are going to damage their children in some way? I don't have time to go over all the studies that exist, but there's no evidence to support the idea that gay parents are any more likely than straight parents to damage their children. Their children end up happy and successful just as often as the children of straight people. So it's another invalid argument, and it's not even relevant. The whole children issue is irrelevant. You only have to look at our current marriage laws to realize that as a nation, we do not define marriage as being solely or even primarily a means of producing children or raising families. If we did, then infertile people would not be allowed to marry. Women past menopause would not be allowed to marry. People who use birth control would not be allowed to marry. We might even offer tax breaks to childless couples who decided to divorce because they wouldn't be fulfilling the tenets of marriage. George Orwell, who unfortunately was right, I mean, if you read 1984, all the slogans, ignorance is knowledge, slavery is freedom, war is peace, and, you know, we have George standing up there saying, when we're talking about war, we're really talking about peace. And I say, when we're talking about gay marriage, we're really talking about 1984, and it was 20 years ago, but really it's here, because I remember in 1984, the state does not allow divorce, but they encourage separation in cases where there are no children. But we don't have these sorts of things because marriage is not now, and it never has been just about children, nor has it required children. This objection is another red herring. But there are some people whose objections to gay marriage are neither religious nor based on children, and some of these people argue that gay marriage will destabilize the institution of marriage in general. And it will, but not in the ways that those afraid of the destabilization suggest. Most people who make this argument never explain exactly how same-sex marriage is going to undercut the general institution. If same-sex couples are allowed to marry, does this mean that fewer straight people are going to get married? Does it mean that fewer straight people are going to stay married? I don't see how. In fact, you could argue that same-sex marriages will strengthen the institution because you'll have thousands and thousands more people who will have a vested interest in maintaining the value of marriage, who will have strong personal reasons to commit themselves to the overall idea that marriage is a good thing. So I could go on showing you example after example of the illogic inherent in most arguments against same-sex unions. But I won't give you example after example. I'll just give you one, the words of George Bush. I quote from his official statement of February 24th, announcing his support of a constitutional marriage amendment. He said, quote, "After more than 2 centuries of American jurisprudence and millennia of human experience, a few judges and local authorities are presuming to change the most fundamental institution of civilization." Now, leaving aside the problem of Bush's historical generalizations, he's making quite a fallacious appeal to tradition. If we carry his argument to its logical conclusion, then we should never have abolished slavery either, since it too had survived for a century of American jurisprudence, and it also had been a fundamental institution of civilization for millennia. So what's going on here? Why are people clinging to their position against the right to same-sex legal unions when even the most basic attention to logic shows that the objections aren't valid? Well, over the years, I've learned some truths. One is that most of our opinions and beliefs have very little to do with logic. And second, there's often a big difference between what people say they are arguing about and think they are arguing about and what they are really arguing about. And I think that's what's going on here. I think the arguments are about something other than what people think they're about. Why do many people want to prohibit gay unions? Is it because of religion or children or tradition or social stability? No. I think it's because same-sex unions will not accomplish the things that we want marriage to accomplish in our society. And it's the things that we have wanted marriage to accomplish that lead me to oppose it, for both straights and gays. I'm going to say something very controversial, but, you know, what's the point of having a pulpit if you can't say something controversial? Historically, and still today, I would say that marriage is not about love, commitment, children, or religion. It is first and foremost about power, about preserving patriarchy, about establishing economic and personal dominance. It's about socially sanctioned inequality for women. Or at least I would say that I believe it is primarily about these things. Any social institution as complicated as marriage obviously serves many complex purposes, and I would never deny that for many individuals, and probably many of you, marriage is about love and intimacy and maybe family. But if you do have a companionate marriage of equality and support, I would say you have built that marriage despite the institution, not because of it. And it's partly because of these defects of the institution as a whole that I would prefer to see gays and lesbians stay outside this particular trap. Now, I'm not trying to challenge. I'm sure many people are saying, come on, I love my husband, I love my wife, I don't want to dominate them. But I'm talking about the social and economic goals of the overall institution, not about how individual couples negotiate the territories of our own relationships. But historically speaking, marriage has not traditionally been about love. It's mostly been about economics and patriarchy. The idea of marrying for love is actually fairly recent in historical terms, gaining primacy only since about the 1700s. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that before 1700 people didn't care about love. Of course they did. You only have to read a little bit of Shakespeare to see that. But often love and marriage were separate issues. Many marriages were arranged, and not just among the nobility. And in the days before DNA testing, or in other words, during most of human history, marriage was a way for males to establish paternity. Or you might say, establish male ownership of children rather than female ownership. And if you don't like the word ownership, I just suggest some of the laws of the not-so-distant past. In 19th century England, for example, husbands had sole legal rights to children. The issue of paternity was so important that it affected divorce laws in England, too. For most of the 19th century, divorce was not possible without an act of Parliament, which effectively put it out of the reach of all but the richest and most powerful. And in order to secure a divorce, a man had to prove adultery. But a woman had to show adultery and another major defect, such as serious battering, or more importantly, her husband's refusal to provide financial support. For a woman, adultery was not enough. For a man, it was. For a man, it was just the possibility that their children might have been fathered by someone else that was enough to justify divorce. For women, for millennia, marriage had to be a business decision almost. In a letter to her favorite niece, Jane Austen said that she was pleased that the girl had waited a while to marry. Austen wrote, quote, "By not beginning the business of marriage and mothering at too young an age, you will remain healthy in mind and figure." And I think her choice of words was no accident. She says the business of marriage, because it was a career decision. Until fairly late in the 20th century, middle and upper class women had little choice of career. Self-support was just not really an option. In the American census of 1900, 86% of adult males were in the workforce, only 20% of women were. A genteel woman had three choices, essentially, in the 19th century and much of the 20th century: living with relatives who often resented her or turned her into an unpaid servant, being a governess, which, as we see in Jane Austen, is not exactly a joyful occupation, or marrying. For working-class women, the need to work outside the home was assumed, but it did not bring financial independence. And until 1885, English women who married literally surrendered their legal personhood. That was the legal language. Any money they inherited or earned was automatically the property of their husbands. Anything they had, even their children, even their identity as an adult, was not theirs. In return for surrendering their legal personhood, women were entitled to financial support from their husbands. And obviously, this sort of financial dependence could hardly encourage marriage as a source of equality and companionship. Legally, and I'm quoting here, British law put women in the following legal category, quote, children, criminals, idiots, and women. And similar things could be said of marriage in the U.S. It never really encouraged equality. Until the 1970s, married women could not get credit in their own names. They could lose their job upon marriage. Single women rarely earned the same salaries as their male counterparts. And it wasn't just financial inequality. There was tremendous social pressure on men and women to marry, and on women to bear children and to stay home with them. And that pressure still exists, as the cover story of last week's Time magazine about women staying at home suggests. And you might be saying, well, that was then, and those were inequalities, but we have eliminated most of them. Women can now be legally and financially independent, and yet marriage has still survived. So does this suggest that marriage is not really about power? And I would say not really, because even today our marriage laws, those often praised benefits of marriage that gay people are desperate to have, are predicated on a model that still encourages female inequality. There's been a lot of talk about the current tax law, which supports what some people have called a marriage penalty. That is, when both members of a couple, a married couple, earn similar amounts, there's a large tax penalty, and they end up paying more tax than they would if they were two single people. However, when one partner makes substantially less, or makes nothing at all, the penalty disappears. So clearly the effect of this situation is to provide financial pressure for one partner to stay at home, or to work part-time. And let's not kid ourselves that the stay-at-home part-timer is going to be the male part of the couple. There's pressure for upper-class women to stay home. And you might say to yourself, well, what's wrong with staying at home? And I say nothing, necessarily, if that's what you genuinely want. But our marriage laws are set up so that your choice isn't particularly free. Our society does have a vested cultural and economic interest in encouraging women to continue age-old patterns of financial and personal dependence, encouraging them to feel guilty if they don't choose motherhood as their major self-definition. So the effect of laws like the marriage penalty and taxes is not to discourage marriage in general. but to encourage inequality within marriage, with women generally the lesser partner. And it has a side effect of encouraging racial and class inequality, too, because the marriage penalty has a disproportionate effect on African Americans and on poorer people in general. Richer people can afford to live on one income or on 1.5 incomes, but poorer people don't have this option normally. And unfortunately, this particular tax penalty is not the only example of socially supported inequality in marriage. And as I've said, it's these inequalities that are one of the main reasons that I have qualms about gay marriage. But I have other ones, too. For one thing, if gay marriages become legal, gay couples will be put under the same social pressure that straight people often face, pressure to conform to a particular social ideal that is by no means the best situation for anyone. The famous writer Naomi Wolf, who had written The Beauty Myth back in the 90s and sort of became a poster child for asserting a variety of women's rights to sexual pleasure and all sorts of things, recently came to speak at Emory and Henry, and I was tremendously disappointed in her speech because I thought it was as regressive as it could be. She just sort of said that it was regressive while it was pretending to be radical and cutting edge, which I think is the most dangerous kind of regression. And she was basically encouraging the students to have sexual experimentation before marriage, and a lot of the students were horrified because they're very religious and they just didn't accept this. And one of them said, "But you're leaving love out of it. What about love?" And she said, "Oh no, I'm not leaving out love. Love is the ultimate. A true love that you join with and you raise children and you spend your life with, this is the ultimate." I thought, no, for you maybe, but to present that as the ultimate is difficult, and I'm afraid that's a pressure that gays and lesbians will face too once gay unions become legal. The very fact that George Bush is lobbying so hard for a $1.5 billion healthy marriage program should give us serious pause. Just how many people outside the conservative mainstream stand to gain from an initiative that would do even more to marginalize those of us who don't choose marriage or those of us who choose to redefine marriage in non-traditional ways? So I think gay people, we need to think long and hard about whether we want to flow into this particular heterosexual mainstream. And I also see gay marriage as supporting a movement toward a possibly dangerous or at least undesirable assimilation. What gay marriage seems to say to the straight world is, don't be afraid of us, homosexuals. We aren't deviant. We're just like you. We have cars and mortgages, children, schools. In other words, some gay people seem to need to say, and some straight people seem to need to hear, that the heterosexual norm is the best social construction after all. That even gay people want to be just like straights, except maybe in the bedroom. To me, the push toward gay marriage is an attempt to deny our valuable differences. It's a challenge to gay identity. In some ways, it's a position similar to that which ethnic minorities face. In order to gain the security and the rights of social acceptance, we're urged to eradicate our differences. We have to claim that we're just the same as the mainstream majority. I think it's no accident that gay marriage is the issue that has united so many straight people behind a gay cause. Why are so many straights jumping on this particular bandwagon? In part, it's because of the reasons I gave earlier. Those opposed to gay unions don't have much logic on their side, and so thinking people can hardly support them. And in part, too, it's because there are many broad-minded, supportive straight people who genuinely want to end the oppression of gays, lesbians, and other sexual minorities. People like many of you, in other words. But I think it's also in part that gay marriage is unthreatening. It's safe. It doesn't challenge current social norms. It reinforces them. It says straight people can support gay rights without really having to rethink the nature of heterosexual privilege or to deal with the sometimes uncomfortable differences that gay people manifest. And I saw this in an article written recently about the people lining up for same-sex marriages in San Francisco. The author of the article pointed out as a positive thing that the people lining up for marriages looked just like anybody else. Unlike, they said, unlike the flamboyance of gay pride parades, and if you've ever been to a gay pride parade, flamboyance is kind of an understated word. They say, they're not like those weirdos, those guys wearing rainbow cod pieces and nothing else. They're just like anybody else, and I think that's a problem. But in the end, I think that I will perhaps be most comfortable with gay marriage if the conservatives are right. Earlier, I challenged the argument, or at least I looked at some of the ways in which the concept of gay marriage will not destabilize marriage as a whole. In important ways, both good and bad, I don't think proponents of marriage have much to fear. But in another way, the challenge to traditional marriage is real, and to conservatives, this challenge is threatening. but to me it's liberating. If gay marriage does happen, and it does challenge the very nature of marriage, then maybe we can make some important changes. Maybe if we have same-sex marriage, we'll be able to identify and eliminate some of the basic equalities of the institution. They'll become more visible with a same-sex couple when we don't see them as much with a mixed couple because we're used to them. Maybe same-sex marriages will force us to redefine marriage in such a way that it does promote equality and companionate support. Or maybe it will allow us not to choose marriage at all. Maybe gay marriage will change the very structure of civilization as we know it. And with any luck, that would be a good thing. Thank you.